Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jen with Slope Garden Center. I'm just going to talk for a little bit while people are logging on. Welcome to our bee-friendly gardening class. I'm really excited to have Bonnie Morse here with us. This is also our fourth Wednesday evening class and our third class in our Summer Garden Spotlight series. So in our Summer Spotlight series, we're highlighting local businesses and artists that integrate a part of the garden in their practice. And this has been really fun to just sort of expand this garden community and to, see how people are using different resources and have a little fun with the garden. So Bonnie is from Bonnie Bee & Co. in Marin County, and I'm really excited to hear what she has to present today. There's a lot of information, a lot of bee-friendly information. Just a little bit more of about our Spotlight series is we will have a smartphone photography class coming up on July 28th. And then we're also going to do a summer lemon berry scone class. And that will be on August 18th at 5 p.m. And then after that, we're going to dive into fall and winter gardening. It's so crazy that we're like basically over halfway through summer and we're thinking about fall and winter. But we will have a preparing your fall edible garden class on August 21st at 10 a.m. All those are listed on our website, so feel free to go and register for any of those classes. I do want to say for this class tonight, I did attach some resource handouts to the reminder email that you would have received about an hour ago. And there's a couple more links that we want you to have. And so I'm going to drop that into the chat. I didn't get them into the reminder email, so we'll just do it now. And so I'll drop those into the chat. Those are really, there's a ton of resources available for you on bee-friendly gardening. And we're here to support and to help encourage. And so please feel free to ask any questions. We are going to take some questions during the presentation. But we're going to reserve most of the questions towards the end of the presentation. So drop your questions into the Q&A. I'll be feeding through them. I see a couple raised hands, so I'm wondering if there's some people that didn't get the handout links that I sent before. So I'm happy to put those into the chat. I'll just put everything in the chat so you all have those. And then I also want to remind you that this will be recorded. And the recording will be available this Friday. So that's July 16th. And what's nice about the recordings is, you can go back and rewind and pause, like if you miss something or whatever. So I think that the recordings are really great. And also just take a look at the list of classes that we've done already. There's a ton of information there. So and it's all free and it's all available and you can watch it from the comfort of your couch. You know what I mean? So that's really awesome. And like I said, we're here to support you on your garden journey, and we're happy that you are here to join us. Bonnie, I'm really excited for your presentation. I know that you have a ton of information to share, so I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to let you take over, and I'll let you know if we have some questions here and there, and then we can do more questions towards the end. So thank you all. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Jen. Thank you, everyone. Oh, Jen, can you enable screen sharing for me? Thank you, everyone, for attending. I'm really excited that you're interested in bee-friendly gardening. It's an important issue. We're dealing with a lot of different things. While she's enabling screen share, oh, here we go. We're getting hit with a lot of things right now. Of course, we're concerned about fires and with this severe drought, but pollinators play an important role in all this too. And as I've told the fire guys, you know, if we don't take care of our pollinators, we're leaving future generations of firefighters with pollination that's favored by wind pollination. And those tend to be the plants that are more flammable, grasses, pines, etc. So all these things really work together, and supporting our pollinators and our bees in our gardens is more important now than ever, just because there's been so many, which I'll get into, problems. So the bee that most of you are probably most familiar with is Apis mellifera. This is the European honeybee. As that name might suggest, they're not from around these parts. However, there are 4,000 species of native bees here in the United States. Right here in California, there are 1,600 species of bees. And here in Marin and the greater Bay Area, the UC Berkeley Bee Lab has identified about 90 species of bees. So a lot of these are in your garden. You might not have noticed them so far, but maybe you'll take a closer look now because they're there. As I said, those European honeybees, they arrived a little bit later. They came, the first ship manifest that we know had honeybees on it arrived in Jamestown, Virginia in 1622. So not that long ago. And they likely would have arrived in hives something like this. These are woven skep hives. On the inside, the whole colony, they basically just build down from the top. And in early America, Thomas Jefferson is quoted as saying that the Indians basically considered the bees the white man's fly. They would move a little bit ahead of the settlers. And they did a great job colonizing the Americas themselves, because when they arrived on the East Coast, think about all those old growth forests with all those beautiful nest cavities that were perfect for them. Took them a little bit longer to get to California. Between crossing the plains and getting over the Rocky Mountains, they needed a hand from a beekeeper who loaded a little over 50 hives up on a steamer in New York. Took about 2 weeks to get down to Panama. That was pre-canal days. They had a one-day railroad trip across Panama where they were loaded onto another steamer up to San Francisco and then through the Delta to Sacramento. And that was our founding population of European honeybees here in California. So what is that? A little less than 120 years. But as I said, there's a lot of bees that are native here in the Bay Area. This is a picture I took just in our backyard, and they vary in size. You might be familiar with the big bumblebees, our carpenter bees. Some are a whole lot smaller. What many people don't realize is, you know, the fact that you might not recognize a lot of bees in your backyard. They're just not as populous as the European honeybees because most of our native bees are solitary. And most of the native bees will nest in the ground. This is a somewhat blurry picture of a bumblebee queen returning to a nest in the fall. So the bumblebees actually only overwinter as a queen. She will scent out for rodent urine on the ground, looking for abandoned rodent holes that they can use as a nest cavity. And while the topic of this talk is bee-friendly gardening, you know, bees are not our only pollinators. There are flies like this hoverfly that pollinates. Our butterflies pollinate. Moths pollinate. As you might be aware, many of our pollinators rely on a specific host plant, which is important when we think about our gardening. Like our poor monarchs that, you know, they only counted a little over 2,000 in their overwintering grounds this last year. 30 years ago, they were counting over 2 million. So really have had a sharp decline. And a lot of that's related to their loss of their host plant. Their larva only eats milkweed. And before we move on, I just want to take this opportunity to let you know about a fantastic resource, which is cowscape.org. You can actually go in and enter your zip code, and it's going to tell you plants that are native to your particular neighborhood. And when you look them up, not only are they going to tell you the plant type and size, flower color, season, it's also going to tell you who takes advantage of it. So for this was a milkweed. I couldn't get the whole screen on here, but it will tell you which species that plant will host of our native moths and butterflies. And it will also tell you if it's deer tolerant, if bees like it. So this is a great resource that we have here in California. And I also just want to mention before we move on, if you're interested in bee-specific information, these native bees, as well as gardening recommendations for them, Helpabeeorg is the website of the UC Berkeley Bee Lab. Lots of great information for you. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about, before we talk about how you can help with your own gardens, let's talk about why bee populations are having trouble, because they are having trouble. A lot of our insect populations are having trouble right now. Now, some of what I'm about to talk about is specific to the European honeybees, but really it's affecting all of our species of pollinators. Specifically to the European honeybees that, people have heard about the bee problems. At first, 2007, when colony collapse disorder was first discussed, a lot of people thought they'd find one silver bullet, one problem that was causing everything. But that's really not the case. And most now believe that it's not a single cause, but really a variety of stressors that are impacting bees all at the same time. One of the big ones are pests. And one of our biggest problems here is the varroa mite. It's a parasitic mite which originated and evolved in Asia and arrived in the US in 1987. I also should note, though, when people hear about bee problems, the population of the European honeybees has not gone down. What has gone down in the US is honey production, because there are so many more bee losses that the beekeepers have to split their hives to make up for those losses. And therefore, they don't have the colony strength to produce the honey. So, but as far as a general population, our European honeybees are faring quite well. What's not faring well are native bees. So the varroa mite that parasitizes our honeybees, they evolved with completely different honeybees. Also Apis, this is a picture of Apis dorsata, the giant honeybees. Here's a picture of Apis florea. This is the dwarf honeybee. You might notice that both of these bees have outside nests. They don't form perennial nests like our European honeybees do. They actually migrate based on forage. And so when they abandon their nests, these varroa mites are breeding in the pupa while the bees are pupating. So if you have a brood break because you're abandoning your nest, it's going to help deal with them. Also, these other bees, including the Asian honeybee, which I don't have pictured here, which does have perennial nests, but tends to swarm a lot. So they have brood breaks frequently. When they made this jump to the European honeybee, which has a longer development time, it was absolutely catastrophic. But that's not our only problem. I mean, think about how quick things spread around the world. Think about how quick COVID spread around the world. So when you get a new novel pest or disease, these poor bees hardly have a chance to adapt to that before they get hit with another problem. So here's one, the small hive beetles. They originated in Africa. The females will lay their eggs in hives. And the larvae, here's some of the larvae here, when they defecate, they kind of have they ferment the honey, so it's not edible to humans or bees anymore. And the bees can actually abscond or leave the hive. And there's a lot more. There's a lot of diseases like this deformed wing I've got here, snotty brood, that is particularly related to those mites. Think of them as like little dirty hypodermic needles that are biting into the bees and spreading lots of diseases. and lots of other long, diseases that we've known about for a long time. But when you keep getting all these different pressures, it just ramps them up. Another big problem is loss of habitat. So, this picture here with the corn, we don't have corn here, but, I don't know if you're aware, in Iowa, over 90% of the land in Iowa is two plants, soybeans and corn. That's it. Less than 0.1% of the entire state of Iowa is native prairies. And here in Marin, you might think of West Marin as thinking it's lots of open land, but the cows graze down most of that. So most of the biodiversity is supported by small strips of land between the road and where the fencing starts. And in urban areas, it's really, we're still operating on this Victorian model where we're thinking about plant aesthetics over function. So, I mean, when you look at something like this, it's very beautiful and pleasing, but a lawn that takes a lot of water, fertilizers, inputs, a hedge that's sheared where most likely it doesn't produce flowers anyways. If we're talking about boxwood, there's not a lot that happens, although the older ones had small axillary flowers that, and we have at our home, which, as I was telling Jen, it's an old Victorian. A lot of these plants were planted 100, 120 years ago. And the boxwood, the single boxwood that we have here still does produce axillary flowers that the bees go to, but I think many of these others wouldn't. This is podocarpus. I believe that's podocarpus up here. I mean, there's really no benefit for biodiversity in this front yard, but there's a lot of inputs that are required. This is a very high input, low output yard. And when you think about it, I mean, I think about this every time I'm flying. We're everywhere. And so if you multiply that kind of landscape out across cities, huge mileage, there's just no place for biodiversity anymore. Monoculture, this is kind of like the corn. This picture here, this is almonds in the Central Valley. When I grew up in the Central Valley, farming, there were definitely almonds, but there were a lot of different crops. Now, because of the price of almonds and the majority of the almonds worldwide are produced here in California, most other crops have been taken out of production. So much of the Central Valley is just this single tree that only blooms for a couple weeks out of the year. That's it. Going back to what I was saying about our native pollinators, who are mostly solitary, they simply can't survive on a single floral source that only blooms for 2 or 3 weeks out of the year. Not only that, but because they're ground nesting, they can't survive with our farming techniques, which disturbs the soil. The almond pollination is the largest pollination event in the world, and it requires over 2 million colonies of honeybees, most of the commercial bees in the United States, to pull this off. But as soon as those blooms stop, those beekeepers have to get those bees out of there or they'll starve. There's nothing there. And when they set them up in the almonds before the bloom, they have to feed them heavily because, again, there's nothing there. And this is part of the problem with spreading pests and diseases, because you're bringing all these bees from all over the United States together in one place. Strong colonies will rob out weak, and any new novel pest or disease that comes into the US is likely shared in the almond pollination. And this is really the reason why after Varroa arrived in the United States, it was in all lower 48 states in under 2 years. And then there's pesticides. To a certain extent, European honeybees can buffer the effects of pesticides because it's a larger colony. And these are beekeeper applied, like for miticides, of course, commercial agriculture. But homeowners, this picture here of a pesticide kill was taken in San Rafael. Related to that, so in 2012, we teamed up with Penn State and did a pollen study, a 9-month pollen study where we collected bee bread from colonies. Overall, we fared pretty well. Didn't find a lot of chemicals in these hives. But what was found was incredibly toxic to bees. So you can imagine if you don't have a colony of bees that has tens of thousands of bees in it, if you have a single solitary bee or a butterfly, they simply can't buffer the effects of this. Of course, the drought is impacting everyone. I mean, we look at just with the European honeybee colonies that we see in a year like this year, they're having a lot of trouble storing excess honey, excess nectar. If they're having trouble with that, so are all the other insects. And then, of course, you know, in these years of extremes, there's a lot of competition for resources. So everyone's hungry, everyone's thirsty, and trying to take advantage of, you know, not a lot that's out there. We see this in the European honeybee colonies with predation by yellow jackets and ants that increases during these types of years. Also skunks. That bear that was spotted in San Anselmo a few weeks ago, he made a snack out of an apiary up on Good Hill Road in Kentfield about a week after that sighting. And then, of course, in more recent years, all this smoke from fires. This, of course, impacts our bees and our other pollinators and insects. As far as the honeybees go, what we noticed, a lot of it varied based on when they were happening and what was burning. So 2017 with the Santa Rosa, it was past the fall flow. We did have slightly higher than average winter losses. But 2018, what summer, that was the Paradise fires, the structural fires, very toxic. I know I still cough a little bit, like after breathing all that air. We had about 70% losses of our European honeybee colonies here in Marin. The larva is very sensitive to particulate matter. So possibly, I haven't been able to locate any research on this, just discussions with researchers about why we may have had such huge losses after that. And they were, you know, I mean, when you think about homes and electronics and chemicals that are being burned in those, so not just particulate matter, but really toxic particulate matter. And then in 2020, that was happening when our bees, our European honeybees, usually in the summer during these dry times when our hills turn brown, they tend to lose weight. So they put on weight in the spring and then they lose weight. And then the coyote bush, which I'll talk about later, those start flowering. And so we get a good fall flow of nectar and pollen. But while that was starting to happen, this smoke was happening. And so the bees were just hunkering down inside and not foraging. We also seem to see greater problems with queen mating. So with bees, smell is so important to them for mating. So with all of that smoke, we have a feeling that the drones just couldn't smell or find those queens. So mating didn't happen. So a lot of queen failures and hence colony failures. Okay, so let's get on to the planting for bees and what you can do. Jen, are there any questions about what I've talked about before we move on to this?
Yeah, we do have a couple questions. This is super amazing. I'm like, my mind is like just the whole thing with the almonds. I had no idea that they brought in all the pollen, and it's like, it's crazy. I mean, you just sort of think about the different levels of this with bees. And anyway, learning a ton. A couple things. One person suggested that it would be helpful to explain to non-beekeepers what bee bread is.
Oh, thank you. I'm so sorry. And please jump in. It's hard for me to always remember. So bee bread, when I was talking about the pollen study, bees are collecting several different things when they're foraging. The main things that they're collecting are pollen, which is where they're going to get their fats and their minerals and their protein, and then the nectar, which they convert to honey, and that's where they get their carbohydrates. So bee bread is actually kind of a mixture of pollen and honey. It's a fermented product. And just a fun fact for those of you who include pollen in your smoothies, don't waste your money because you're not accessing the protein. We can't break down the outside walls of the pollen to really maximize that protein intake. Neither can the bees. So they bring that raw pollen back in, and then they're mixing it with a little bit of honey, and that which has also some bee enzymes in it, and that is helping break down the walls of those pollen grains so that their larva can digest it.
Very cool. And then another quick question, doesn't care and breeding too close together of honeybees contribute to their decline?
Doesn't care and breeding?
Yeah, does care and breeding too close together of honeybees contribute to their decline?
It absolutely can, because, especially like if you have, breeding is our first defense for mite resistance or tolerance. But the problem happens when you're interjecting bees that don't have that same level of resistance or tolerance. And then, basically their problems are getting picked up on by strong colonies. So anecdotally, back when CCD first struck, and varroa mites first made it to Marin, there weren't that many beekeepers, and they just took their losses. They were treatment free. They took their losses. They built back from, the surviving stock. They were hit pretty hard. So survival of the fittest. And actually, third world countries are really ahead of us with some of these mite problems because they didn't have the resources or the finances to put chemicals into the system. So South Africa is a great example. Varroa hit there, huge problem, survival of the fittest. It's not even mentioned in their bee journals anymore. In America, we did what we do all the time, like throw a pill at it, throw a chemical. So now we've actually bred super mites. There's a lot more intense breeding going on now. But yeah, when you have more bees, it's like spreading any kind of disease, it's going to be more of a problem. But the Marin beekeepers have been working pretty hard for over a decade now. And this is actually why Gary and I started our business, is to provide a local source of bees. Bee surveys that we were doing showed that locally adapted stock had much higher survival rates than these packaged bees coming in from commercial beekeepers who were selecting their bees for very different reasons and tended to be treating them very heavily, often with very harsh chemicals that then they became resistant to for the mites. So that's definitely an issue. And there are a lot of beekeepers. It's tough to be a bee, and therefore it's tough to be a beekeeper. And I think eventually they'll reach an equilibrium. But one of the benefits, I think, of seeing even like a little bit too high a population of honeybees is that the people who are taking care of the bees really connect with nature in a way that they would never have otherwise. They're more careful thinking about what they're planting in their gardens. They're more careful thinking about what kind of chemicals they might be putting in their gardens. They're talking to their neighbors about this stuff. So I see it as really like an agent of change, a change of social consciousness that's positive. And again, it's tough to be a beekeeper. So some people just wash out because it's just too much work.
Yeah. Well, on that note, let's figure out what plants we can plant.
All right, let's talk about what we can all do, like to help bees, because we can all play a role. Every little bit makes a difference, not just for protecting our biodiversity, but also conserving water and improving our defensible space for fires. It's all interconnected. And I see this time as an opportunity for us to all kind of, retool and address all these issues at once. I think the low-hanging fruit is really removing undesirable exotic plants that have little to no ecological benefit and have a higher fire risk. This is a black acacia. I mean, mature trees, and I'm also an ISA certified arborist, so I have a lot of respect for trees and the many benefits they offer. I mean, everything from erosion control, like helping the soil not desiccated for plants that are underneath, shade, et cetera, et cetera. But this Blackwood acacia, which is right next to our carriage house, or was right next to our carriage house, this could not be safely limbed up to a level the fire department would want. It drops a lot of dry debris for fire season. There's just really no redeeming value to it. It's very invasive. And I think the only ecological value to it was a little bit of bird nesting activity. I mean, arguably, yes, there was carbon sequestration, but if a fire tore through here, not good. This is juniper. Yes, it's drought tolerant, but you can find a lot of good natives that are just as drought tolerant. It just tends to have a lot of dried debris in the middle of it, which makes it very hazardous in a fire. And bamboo, it's possible. There are a lot of beautiful bamboos. We have some in our yard. The problem is that, and as Todd Lando, who's with Fire Safe Marin, told me one time, you know, I mean, he's seen bamboo where you could take a propane torch to it and it's not going to light. But the problem is that 99% of the people don't maintain it in a fire safe manner. So there's a lot of debris that accumulates around the base that can be a problem. So I see this really, we have an opportunity to really clean things up from a fire perspective and improve biodiversity. Again, going back to cowscape.org, you can put your zip code in there. It's going to come up with a whole, you know, all these different categories of plants that you can look for. I don't have that in this talk, but the California Native Plant Society on the Marin chapter has a great link on their website that they created about native plants that fulfill the same purposes of many of these plants that we're being asked to remove for fire purposes, but are native and have less flammable qualities to them. So I really encourage you to use this fantastic resource. And you know, you can create these amazing plant islands during fire season by using native annuals in between these plant islands or these shrubs. So here's a picture during fire season. This is the same bed in spring. The natives annuals that happen to be in this are like chicory, miner's lettuce. This is a bed at our house. And I just let them do their thing in spring. And by the time that fire season rolls around, they will have, you know, dried up, reseeded themselves, so ready for next year, and ready to go with some nice plant separation for fire season. And this also, that benefits, you know, when you think about our native pollinators and bees, you know, they've evolved with this Mediterranean system. So by the time fire season rolls around, a lot of them are already pupating in the ground for next season. You know, they're not going to emerge until after next winter. When you're planting for bees, they prefer to visit a single floral source on a foraging trip. So what the UC Berkeley research has shown is you need provide a patch size of the same species of at least 3 feet by 3 feet for each species. Otherwise, they're not necessarily going to be very attracted to it. And I get asked all the time by people saying, you know, I was in the nursery, I saw bees all over this plant, and then I took it home and I haven't seen anything. Well, in the nursery, there was probably a large grouping of them, so it was worth their while. Once you get it home, you got to wait till it gets a little bit bigger to attract them. Another example of density here. Beautiful California buckwheat here in the foreground, but nice big plots of the same plants. Really important that you think about planting a variety of plants that bloom at different times of the year. So, for example, Cyanothis is a native plant that is, you know, again, evolved with our native bees. So it tends to start blooming right around the time when they're emerging from pupation in late winter. And, you know, if you want to see a large variety of bees, just stand next to a large Cyanothis for about 10 minutes. And if you look closely, I think you'll see at least 10 species of bees on those. Not a lot blooms, you know, I mean, just look out here right now, what's blooming. When our hills dry up and turn brown, so do many flowers. Find plants that bloom in July and August to feed pollinators. I find it really interesting when we look at the list of plants that are invasive, and you look at what's in Marin that is considered on the California invasive species list. And a lot of them are plants, Fennel, star thistle, things that are blooming in the summer when little else is. And I think there's also a direct connection between European honeybees and those plants, because, you know, again, our native pollinators, you know, their timing is set to when different things are blooming, and some have specific relationships with specific plants. You know, some of them aren't even active, or are only active for a couple of weeks a year. But I think that some of these invasive exotic plants, they're blooming when nothing else is. Ligustrum is another great example of a summer blooming plant. So the European honeybees that we introduced are all over them. In the fall, our native coyote bush, bacarus, is so important for helping bees get ready for winter. Actually, bacarus has been noted as supporting over 400 species of native insects. The fire guys get a little concerned about the bacarus, but the great thing about bacarus is, you know, they're concerned about the old plants that have woody growth in them. But the wonderful thing is you can literally cut those to the ground and they're going to resprout, and the new growth is pretty fire resistant. Another really important thing that you want to do is, you know, ask the local nursery, ask the guys, gals, if the plants you're looking at, if they're sourcing stock that has been treated with neonicotinoids. It's a class of pesticides banned in many areas of the world. In more and more research, it causes memory problems in insects. I mean, it's a nerve toxin, and it shortens lifespan. Again, on a colony level with the European honeybees, possibly not so bad, although I know Vermont beekeepers who, since they introduced these seed-coated corn that was seed-coated with the neonics, they're having much higher losses the last few years. And it's also got a very long life in the soil. So yeah, if you're planting for bees, you don't want to be getting contaminated stock. Okay, weeds. Weeds are all in the eye of the beholder. You know, one person's weed is another animal's dinner. So fennel, yes, it is, you know, kind of invasive. I always leave a few patches of fennel in our yard. And not only is it a host plant for the swallowtail butterfly, there are other host plants for the swallowtail butterfly as well, but it also provides food for the bees, native and honey. I see on that during the summer. And then I see birds on it in the fall eating the seeds. Dandelion, similar plants in Asteraceae family, very popular with bees for collecting pollen. So yeah, you really have to get rid of it. They can provide a lot of food. On the East Coast, dandelions are actually one of the earliest season plants that really provide the pollen, the protein those bees need to build up their population for the season, early in the season. So do something for the bees and something for yourself. They love plants that you use in your cooking. I was just at a client recently and the bees were all over her oregano. They love it. Oregano, long bloom time. I don't know why this keeps going forward without me touching it. Anyway, sorry about that. Thyme, basil, mint, sage, rosemaries, pretty much any of the cooking herbs, the bees love it. And there is research that shows that when bees are sick, they will shift foraging preferences. So possibly they're getting some medicinal value from these. There's no specific research I've seen to indicate that at this point, but it would make sense if in other larger studies, they're shifting their foraging preferences, that they're, getting something of value from these plants. Okay, this is a big one that a lot of people don't think about. Not all flowers are created equally. There are exceptions to every rule, of course, but in general, pollinators are going to prefer the straight species to cultivars. Here's an example. So this is this pomegranate in our yard. It's been here 120 years. It has never fruited. It will never fruit. It would never be able to reproduce on its own. It can only be reproduced through grafting. That pollen and nectar is held so tightly, bees can't get to it. Here is the straight species of pomegranate. And, we have, going back to that, us selecting plants for aesthetics, not for function. So we look at these like pretty, double, triple flowers, pretty colors, but are they providing any biological benefit? And going back to the fact that there are so many of us and we cover so much land mass now, that is important. Another example are roses. So the native rose, per the Cowscape.org website, might host 70 species of butterflies and moths. Nothing is getting into these rose flowers. Nothing, it's just not going to happen. These nice, big, open flower, get in there to that nectar and pollen, that plant can reproduce itself. And a plant that can reseed itself annually is going to save you time and money. And I have this picture of nasturtiums. I think this is a great example. My husband and I, about 20 years ago, we got a bunch of nasturtium seeds, and we got, some variegated and different colors, and we kind of threw them out all over the yard. We never seeded again. They come up annually. The only ones that continue coming up, they're the straight species. So all those fun ones that had been, heavily cultivated, they're not reproducing themselves. And I love that this is one of those annuals you can use to fill in spaces for spring. You can eat the flowers, you can eat the petals. I see hummingbirds, I see bumblebees, I see honeybees in those flowers. Eliminate chemicals in your garden. A well-planned garden is going to include plants that are appropriate to our soil and climate, and it's unlikely going to need them. It's really plants that are under severe stress, that are going to need to have other inputs. If other things are in balance, you really won't need to use chemicals. We haven't used any chemicals in our garden in 20 years. You don't want to be too tidy. Again, just think about these insects that evolved. There's leaf litter that they can hide in, that they can overwinter in. So you don't want to be too tidy. Of course, from a fire perspective, obviously the fire guys don't want to see something like this close to a house, although it's great for nesting. They don't want to see these dried plant stalks, although there are bees that overwinter in dried plant stalks. So, just plan for areas in your garden where you can allow for this to happen. What's important is that, try to keep it away from structures and keep it in small islands so that you don't allow for continuous fire fuels. And UC Berkeley, the Bee Lab, they call it mulch madness. You need to leave bare dirt for ground nesting bees. If everything is mulched, those solitary bees, those native bees, can't access the dirt to create their nest. So they'll tunnel in there. The female will lay, sometimes a few eggs. She'll leave some pollen and nectar, a little ball, lay an egg on top of it. And then that's going to pupate until conditions are right for them to emerge. This soil here, this is at Dominican University, and it's near some redwoods. That's bare soil. If we could zoom in here, you would see a bunch of holes for ground nesting native bees. So leave some bare patches of soil. Hedges and English ivy, let them bloom before pruning back. You know, a lot of people don't even realize that English ivy can bloom, but boy, it does. It blooms in the summer, although you don't necessarily want it to, because again, that's another invasive species. Probably one of the reasons, because these European honeybees, you can see one right here, when that's blooming, they're all over it because there's very little else blooming. I'll just mention really quickly, you know, Jen and I were talking before, I'm going to be doing a webinar later this year in October talking about beyond the lawn, how you can, you know, kill unwanted areas of vegetation, specifically lawn, but also things like English ivy that maybe provide, you know, habitat for rats and mice that you might not want to encourage. So we're going to be talking about how you can get rid of that without chemicals and replant with other things. But as far as other hedges, there's a lot of great hedges out there. Escallonia, ligustrum, things that if you let them bloom, they'll provide a lot of food for bees. When we look at our planting time, fall is really the ideal planting time, because it's going to be followed by hopefully winter rains, but we have 2 seasons of root growth here. It's fall and spring. And that allows for 2 seasons of root growth before we get into our dry summer, which is going to require less water. If you plant things in the middle of summer, like right now, you may as well just keep them in the planting pot in a place where it's going to require less water until you get to fall, because it's not going to, that root ball is not going to expand at this time of year. To learn more about making, this is a great guide that they came out with in 2019. So Xerces Society, fun family activity. You can get in here and you actually rate all these different things on your property. And so you can see where you can really improve for helping improve biodiversity. And happy to take questions now. And thank you all so much for being here tonight.
Wow, that was awesome information. Thank you so much, and a lot to take in. I actually have a question, and just in listening to you talk about European bees versus native bees. I mean, do we want to not encourage European bees and encourage more native bees, or or do we just want to encourage all bees in general? Does that make sense? Like it seems like maybe the Europeans are sort of can be overpowering.
Well, kind of like the European people.
Right. No, that's what I'm saying.
None of us are natives. No,
native.
There's different research. Like some of the research shows that when you have natives and Europeans like competing, it actually improves pollination.
Oh.
And then is research that shows where some of it can be negative, because, you know, think of like flowers as dirty doorknobs where they're sharing diseases. And of course, again, the native bees, if they're solitary, don't necessarily have the buffering benefit. But I want to, you know, really say that I think that people getting into beekeeping is taking them to a whole new level, is taking communities to a whole new level. And I'll just say this, you know, I challenge everyone listening to this, as you drive around, look at landscapes and think about what inputs are required and what outputs are required. Because when I drive around, I'm appalled at like what has to go into a landscape and how little actually comes out, you know? And so I think if this brief time with people's obsession with honeybees kind of brings them into that, there's benefit. In 2019, I did where I was really concerned about, you know, what was happening with the fire community and how some of their the regulations they were pushing for vegetation management was going to affect biodiversity. And I did a kind of quick and dirty study in San Rafael with a gal to look at how many plants could actually support pollinators in landscapes. So we went to 5 different communities, and we kind of randomly selected 5 properties within those. And on average, there were only 4.7 plants in front yards that could support pollinators. but
Really?
could, because many of them were sheared so they wouldn't. Many of them were small, like a tiny little plant, like one, so it's not going to attract anything. Some of them were succulents that, you know, bees would come to, but they bloom so infrequently, they really wouldn't provide much. But the startling thing was in 25 properties, there were only 8 native plants observed. 8 total.
No, I believe that. I mean, I'm seeing gardens all, you know, I do consultations all the time. I
Right.
rarely see native plants.
Right. But that's the problem. That's a problem, because
It
that's a
is.
problem. And
Yeah.
it's a problem for biodiversity. And the fact is, like, if people plant natives, not only does that support, you know, and I say when people want to plant for bees, you plant natives, if any insect is attracted to them, the honeybees are also going to be attracted to them. You know, so yeah.
Yeah, and a point, just like a sidebar off of that, is when Bonnie mentioned that fall is for planting, one thing to keep in mind is, you know, if you are getting rid of your lawn or you want to replace with natives or whatnot, or drought tolerant plants, those plants aren't considered drought tolerant until they're considered established.
Right.
And it can take 8 to 10 months for those plants to be considered established.
Or more, 2 to
Or
3
more, or
years.
yeah,
Yeah.
depending on the plant. And
Yeah.
so I think that there's this perception, especially this time of the year when we're in drought and it's very very hypersensitive to it, where we're just like, you know, take this out and put in some sage or whatever, and just feel like you don't have to water it. And that's not true. So by waiting until the fall for that project, then we're taking advantage, hopefully, of the fall and winter rains, and we're offsetting that water budget a bit, and we're getting those plants established more. So just a little tip on that planting thing.
Yeah.
Um,
I see something in here about hydration stations.
oh yeah, right. We were talking about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, definitely everything needs water. The important thing about like water or bird baths or even bird feeders is cleaning them regularly.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I mean, I always, with beekeepers, we always tell them, like, if you've got bees, you need to have water because they need water.
I mean, I kind of find like I'll put out a saucer with some gravel in it, and there's, you know, enough water for the bees for a certain amount of time, and then it sort of dries up throughout the day. So, and then I kind of just rinse it out after that. So I hope that that's good in terms of disease, but then they can climb on the rocks and they don't drown.
I see Jean is asking about borage. Borage is awesome. Yeah, bees and pollinators love it, and it's such a cool flower. I don't water enough in our garden, and
Same.
yeah, for borage, but yeah,
Yeah.
with a little water, or just being closer to the coast, it's amazing, and it does reseed itself, and yeah, it's just such a cool flower. It's like alien like. Yeah, yeah.
It's one of those plants that, you know, it feels like to me sometimes if you don't want it, you can't get rid of it. Like if it's in your garden, because it just seeds so readily. And then
I wish I had that problem in our garden
that's
with.
what I'm
Yeah,
saying. Yeah.
yeah,
And in my own garden,
yeah.
it's hard for me to get it started. So if you have borage, keep it going.
Katie was asking about native gardening books. Were you able to get that link out, Jen?
Yeah, I put it in the chat. I should have I put it in the chat. It should be on our website, the links that you sent me.
And if someone doesn't, um, if someone didn't get it, you can email me and I'll send it to you, because it's a whole list of great. Katie, I'm sending you that, Bonnie.
Yeah, and you can email me too. My email is all over. And Bonnie, thank you so much for your time and expertise. This has been incredible. You know, I learned a lot myself, and it is, I think, to your point, really important to sort of think about the inputs in our garden and the outputs, and, you know, keeping in mind that the pollinators are really important to consider in what we're putting in our garden, for many reasons, basically. And
Um,
so, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, Doug Tallamy, which, you know, I see you nodding, so you're familiar with his work.
Well, you
Um,
sent me the thing. Yes.
yeah, he started a new website called homegrownnationalpark.org. And
I signed up for it. I'm on it now.
it's
My God.
amazing to me
Yeah.
that we have 40 million acres of turf grass, of lawn in the United States. I mean, when you think about like when, when we talk about loss of biodiversity, loss of pollinators, bees like the rusty-passed bumblebee in the Midwest that used to be ubiquitous and everywhere, and now it's on the endangered species list. I mean, so the thing, individual choices we each make really do add up. They're
Yeah.
important.
And like Bonnie said, she will be back in October. I don't have the date right in front of me, but I want to say it's the 9th. And she will be doing the Beyond Lawns thing. So that's going to be really important. Also, that's a time to reconsider your lawn space. Like we were saying, you do want to reconsider that stuff in the fall. And thinking about more drought tolerant plants, native plants, plants that encourage biodiversity and whatnot. And so she will be diving into that in October, and that should be up on our website in the next week or so. So look for that to register. And like I said, we're both here to support to support you on your gardening journey. Of course, we want bee-friendly gardens all over the land, everywhere. So feel free to email us with your questions. Bonnie, do you have anything you want to say before we close out?
I don't think so. Just thank you everyone for tuning in and being concerned with this topic. And hope to see you at another webinar sometime.
Sounds good. Go plant some bee-friendly plants. Have a good evening, everyone.
Good evening, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Bonnie.
Yeah.